что прочнее?
Which is stronger, paper or rock? The answer isn't as simple as it seems. In the year 631, the French king Dagobert I went to war against the first Slavic Tsar, Samo. The first battle took place by the walls of Vagatisburg Fortress. The memory of that event remains on paper in various chronicles. The rock, the fortress, though, did not stand the test of time. Where was that battle? Where is Vagatisburg Fortress? That's one of the most interesting mysteries of early Slavic history, and we'll try to solve it. Our journey began in Turkey, at the archaeological excavations of a settlement called Çatalhöyük, which many historians believe to be the first ever Indo-European city. Following the Indo-Europeans, we then journeyed on to the southern Urals, where the famous city of towns with Archim at the forefront can be found. Now another journey awaits us, to Central Europe, where in the 7th century, the first known Slavic government emerged. Rivers, ribbons of water that helped ancient peoples settle all over the planet. They changed through the millennia. Civilizations grew and vanished over the span of time. It's often difficult, almost impossible to find their ends. But there are rivers that have remained in human memory as the original birthing rivers. The Danube is one such river to the Slavic peoples. An enormous pot of a multitude of ethnicities and peoples. When did the crystallization of a new ethnicity, the Slavic people, take place? The first archaeological cultures of the Slavic type are from between the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. The first written evidence of the Slavs comes from the 5th century BC. They had different names in antiquity: the Pahari, Scythians, Veneti, Antes. Only later did the terms Sklevani and Slavs appear. Where exactly did the separation of the Slavs from the Indo-European tree occur? Where did they emerge into the light and begin to live as a distinct people? There are several leading hypotheses. One of these theories names the area between the Vistula and Oder rivers as the Slavic homeland. The other theory suggests that their homeland lay in the Middle Dnieper area. And finally, a third theory considers it to be the banks of the Danube in southern Europe. The river Danube twice played a fateful role in the history of the Slavic people. It was here, on its banks, that the first Slavic empire emerged. In the year 620, a merchant named Samo went eastwards with a caravan. He set up camp where the Danube and Morava rivers meet. While Samo and his people rested, news came that troops of steppe nomads, the Avars, were nearing the camp. Samo asked the local Slavs for help, and they set up an ambush in the forest. The Avars were defeated. The brave merchant's heroic act became famous throughout the neighboring settlements. From that triumph, the history of Samo's empire began at the merging of the Morava and Danube rivers. This place is known for the existence of two water and trade routes. It's a place of importance. This was a border where there was contact between the Avars and Slavs. This is where the first meeting of the Slavs and Avars took place. This is where the first conflict arose, and a rebellion grew out of it, which Samo involved himself with and aided through his experience. We know of Samo's powerful empire thanks to written records, known to historians as the Chronicles of Fredegar. The fourth book of the Chronicle contains a detailed description of the opposition of the Frankish king, Dagobert I, to the Slavic ruler, Samo. In truth, this is the only original source of information. All other written records emerged later. The Chronicle of Fredegar was first published in Russian in 2015. Many mysteries are tied to this manuscript. Not even the work's author is known. Some researchers believe it was written by several people rather than just one. One argument is put forward for the co-authoring claim. Researchers note that the geographical and thematic focus of the narrative always changes. Moreover, they also comment on what appear to be stylistic differences in various parts of the chronicle. The first 3 tomes of the chronicle are dedicated to the general history of the Franks and have been compiled from other sources. Only the 4th book of the Chronicle is original. It is where the narrative describes the history of the Frankish kingdom in the 6th and 7th centuries. And it talks about the peoples neighboring the empire. The information it provides, however, is rather fragmented. As one French historian ironically noted, the Chronicle of Fredegar is written in a very confusing language. The only thing that we can say definitely about these tomes is that their author was named Fredegar. The original part of the Chronicles contain important information on the history of the Franks. Yet in this part of the text, the author chooses, on several occasions, to digress into the history of the peoples that neighbored the Franks. It's in these chapters precisely, which are dedicated to the history of the Slavs, that we are told about Samo's empire and about Samo himself. Who was Samo? Where was the capital of his empire? And where did the famous battle against the Frankish king Dagobert take place? The Chronicle does not give a definitive answer, thus spawning many different theories and interpretations. The Carantanians, Slovaks, Moravians, Czechs, Serbs. Numerous Slavic peoples lived in Europe by the 6th century. Why did they live as scattered tribes for so many centuries, and then in the 7th century suddenly decide to form an empire under the rule of a foreign merchant, Samo? The reason is clear: an external threat. In the 6th century, hordes of nomadic Avars headed into Central Europe. The Avars enforced a toll on the Slavs, who lived on the banks of the Danube, and for almost 70 years held them in fear. If we believe the chronicles of Fredegar, the Avars attacked the Slavs, burnt their villages and harvests, they took the men as slaves, and raped the women. Evidence of the cruelty of the Avars still sends a shiver down the spine. But was it really the case? Some researchers believe the information is unreliable, as it contradicts other chronicles. In those records, it's written that the Slavs themselves did not shy away from robbing neighboring peoples and often acted in alliance with the Avars. Where is the truth? The historical debate continues. It must be understood that the Avars oppressed more strongly the Slavs living on the territory of the Khaganate, or in proximity to it. They were under their yoke and were forced to pay taxes. Their women were raped, and all those other horrible things happened as well. Here in central Moravia, in the north of modern-day Slovakia and the Czech Republic, lived free Slavic settlers, who were only partly under the influence of the Avars. It is possible that sometimes the Avars would come here to demand taxes, but it is absolutely certain that there was no oppression within any part of Moravia or the Czech Republic. One opinion is agreed on by all. The Avar yoke is not a made-up concept. The Slavs truly were subjected to Avar rule before the arrival of the merchant called Sama. Who was Sama? What was his ethnic origin? Researchers also debate this topic. In the chronicles of Fredegar, it is clearly stated Sama's occupation was a merchant, but in origin he was a Frank. Prior to the Second World War, pro-fascist historians used this fact to prove the inferiority of the Slavic race. In the 7th century, the Slavs called on Sama to be their ruler. In the 9th, it was Rurik. From this, the Nazis concluded that the Slavs were unable to independently form their own state. It's difficult to argue with an ancient chronicle, yet some historians cast doubt on the versions that claim Samo was a Frank, or in Latin, Nationi Francus. The fact is that in this time, natio could have meant not only ethnic belonging, but also geographical affinity, meaning that a person deemed to be a Nationi Francus may have been of any ethnicity, but would have been born in a territory ruled by Franks. The Chronicle of Fredegar speaks of him as a Frank, but this does not mean that he was a Frank by birth. He could have been a Roman living in the Frankish Empire, or anyone else who had experience in the accompaniment of caravans, in trade, and in warfare knowledge. If not a Frank, then who? According to another theory, Samo was a Slav. One important point supporting this hypothesis is the name of the Tsar, Samo. Perhaps it's a shortened version of the Slavic name Samoslav. Researchers propose that Samo was perhaps an incorrectly interpreted title, meaning that the author of the Chronicle tomes had heard a word in a language unfamiliar to him and thought it to be a name. In reality, Samo could have been a title, like Duke, for example. Geographically, the Slavic lands were a buffer between the Avar Khaganate and the Frankish Kingdom of Austrasia. The Franks feared Avar expansion and, based on one version of events, used Samo as a spy to set the Slavs against the Avars. He might not have been a merchant. He could have been a missionary of the Frankish ruler sent to the Central European Slavs to become their leader and organize an opposition against the Avars. Thus, he would have been creating a shield of resistance on the western border of the Frankish Empire against Avar penetration into the empire, for example, into Bavaria. Unfortunately, we cannot be absolutely certain of this based on the chronicle. We can only look through several theories. It's unlikely that a conclusive evaluation will ever be made. It seems that it was a chain of coincidences and chance that led to Samo taking up Slavic rule. He set up camp here, where the Morava and Danube meet. He made friends with the local Slavs, and alongside them successfully repelled an attack from the Avarian cavalry. News of the brave and strong warrior spread through the settlements, and so new warriors began to come together under the banners of Samo's army. Devin Castle, built up to the skies in the exact location where the Danube and Morava merge. This is the contemporary of and witness to those ancient events. Inspired by his success, Samo began controlling passage along the Danube and taking taxes from voyaging merchants. A year later, in 621, he successfully defeated another Avarian army. This became the foundation of Samo's empire. Slavic tribes exhausted under the prolonged yoke of the Avars, united under one ruler. It's known that he dived in and helped the Slavs battle against the Avars in the first rebellion against them. He acted decisively, acted the role of a man of experience, a brave man who could be followed. Thus, the Slavs selected him as their leader. Not a king, I wouldn't go as far as to say that, but a leader most definitely. This was a Western man who knew war tactics. It's even possible that while journeying around all the Slavic settlements with his caravan, he explained to the Slavic peoples what would come to be if they joined forces, and they heard him and chose him as their ruler. The people's trust in Samo was justified. He quickly moved from a defensive tactic to that of attack. Gradually, he freed the Slavic settlements of the Avarian yoke. Thanks to Samo, the Slavs were freed from one enemy, the Avar Khaganate. Yet soon they were faced with a new one, the Frankish Empire of Austrasia. In the Chronicle of Fredegar, the main foe of the Slavic Tsar is described in great detail. This was the Frankish king Dagobert I. The growing independence of the Slavs had long annoyed him. He decided to wage war against Samo, and soon a pretext presented itself. In the year 628, Dagobert sent his envoy, Sichari, to Samo. Not long before that, the Slavs had robbed a Frankish merchant caravan and killed all the merchants. The king was enraged, and through his envoy demanded compensation for his losses, as well as subjugation. Yet Sichari exceeded his authority and began insulting the Slavs, calling them unfaithful dogs. "If we are dogs, then we're allowed to bite you," responded Samo, and ordered the envoy to be thrown out of the camp. In all probability, both Samo and Dagobert had consciously exacerbated the conflict. Based on one version, Samo was a Frankish spy. Having carried out his task to organize a Slavic opposition against the Avars, he was to step back. However, having developed a taste for power, that was no longer his objective. It's evident that a powerful emperor would not have been gathering a strong army to head east simply because of one caravan of merchants. It seems more likely that Samo, at one point in time sent by Dagobert to the Slavic lands, ceased to obey him. He gained such authority that Dagobert no longer looked upon this happily and decided to provoke a conflict. War waited for no one. Dagobert I gathered a large army and mobilized it against the Slavs. In the Chronicle of Fredegar, it is indicated that Dagobert attracted his allies, the Longobards and Alamans, to the mobilization. They set off towards Samo's empire from various sides. The king himself led the Third Frankish army. The Slavs knew of the imminent approach of the enemy and prepared for battle. In the first encounters, though, against the Alamans and Longobards, they suffered misfortune. Soon, Dagobert I had approached the borders of Samo's empire. The fate of the First Slavic Empire hung by a thread. Where did the final, most important battle between the Slavs and Franks take place? This is one of the major mysteries in the history of Samo's empire. In the Chronicle of Fredegar, it is written that the battle took place at the walls of Vagatisburg fortress, yet it gives neither a concrete nor approximate location of this fortress. For 2 centuries, historians and archaeologists have tried to identify the site. There is no indication of any geographical location. We must firstly, therefore, use our archaeological findings. There are active and continuing archaeological excavations in the Czech Republic. Many ancient settlements, burial sites and fortresses have already been discovered. Sometimes researchers stumble upon real 6th to 7th century artifacts from the time of Samo's empire. This ceramic vessel of the so-called Prague type represents the first Slavic ceramics, found here on the territory of Europe. This particular vessel was found right here in the city of Starbesto, in a Slavic cemetery, some 100 meters from where we stand. It was made in the second half of the 6th or first half of the 7th century. It contains the cremated remains, ashes, of a person who had lived alongside Samo. This could have been a person from Samo's time. Archaeologists sometimes find ceramics from the 6th and 7th centuries, yet all of these are rare and varied finds. So far, researchers have been unable to make any large discoveries connected with Samo's empire. For archaeology, this epoch is unexplored territory, terra incognita, awaiting its first discoverers. František Červený from the Czech city of Olomouc is someone who's dedicated his whole life to finding Vagatisburg fortress. Most researchers are looking for Vagatisburg fortress on the western borders of the modern-day Czech Republic, where the boundary of Samo's empire had once been. Different theories put the location of the fortress in the periphery of the Máčlice, Cheb, or Kárden towns. Červený has his own theory as to the location of Vagatisburg fortress. A mere 20 kilometers from Olomouc sits the ancient city of Prešerov. At one point in history, there was a fortress here in place of the central city square, the walls of which were rebuilt multiple times and can still be seen from the side of Bečva River. House number 26 stands here, on the central square of Przerov. From the outside, it's an ordinary house, but underneath sits an unseen, underground part of the fortress. We're currently standing under the watchtower, where guards would have lived. This watchtower had these gates, which we can see now. These are very quickly assembled gates. They're not aesthetic because they were erected in such haste, in order to defend the fortress entrance against possible destruction by fire. Here in the basement, Červený discovered another of these gates' remains, already walled in. They're also visible from the outdoor, external side of the fortress. At one point, they would have existed under another of the watchtowers. We can see here that one part of the masonry is older than the other. Here, have a look. This was done in the 15th century. Originally, this was used to enter the fortress with wagons. According to the official hypothesis, the fortress was built in the 12th or 13th century. There was no tower then, yet Červený disagrees. He believes the tower was built in the 7th century, when the fortress was ruled by Emperor Samo. Researchers say this was a Gothic structure, but that's not so. It was built from hurriedly gathered rocks. This isn't a carefully constructed and planned building. It couldn't be Gothic. In the 12th century, construction was carried out clearly and calculatedly. Here, though, we can see that the gates were built out of whatever rock was found in the vicinity. Why were the ancient builders in such a rush? And how did Samo end up in Przerov? Červený has come up with his own theory. Przerov is a small town with a rich history. The famous Amber Road, used by merchants to transport amber from the Baltic to the Mediterranean regions, once led through here. Researchers think that the tax point, where merchants had to pay customs and where their caravans rested, was situated in this town. Červený sides with the theory that Samo was sent by the Frankish king Dagobert I, yet his mission was two-sided. On the one hand, he was to organize a Slavic rebellion against the Avars. His other task was to take over the taxation zone and all the money flowing through it. At first, Samo controlled the customs as instructed by Dagobert I. He then came out from under the Frankish king's rule and began to lead independently. It was Przerov that became the center of his empire. And now, the investigation's main conclusion. If Przerov was the capital of Samo's empire, then it's logical to assume that it was the Franks' main target during their attack on the Slavs. This would mean that Vagatisberg Fortress was situated right here in Przerov. The walls of the tower, hurriedly built before the attack, testify to this theory. So does the ford across from the fortress, which Dagobert's armies could have used. We stand under the walls of Samo's Vagatisberg Fortress, where the most horrific battle of the early Middle Ages took place. From one side came the Avars, from the other the Franks. They crossed the river. Here was where the Vagatisberg Fortress guards held victory over them in a difficult 3-day battle, a bloody 3-day war. František Červeny's theory appears neat and logical, but alas, it is only a hypothesis. Official historical research cannot prove it. Most researchers lean towards the idea that the legendary battle took place not in the center of Samos Empire, but somewhere on its western borders. Vagatisburg Fortress itself could simply have been temporary. This could have been a place where the Slavs set up their defenses or wooden and clay-based reinforcements. They had to be situated where the foe's armies were supposed to show up. It was built purposefully to await an attack. In that case, it might not have been a relatively small and fortified center, consistently populated, but a fortification set within a forest or a cliff, which the Frankish armies were supposed to come to. Samos Empire was extremely spread out, and it's not possible to determine where the city of Vagatisburg was based on one single mention. Not one theory presented by linguists has found any archaeological evidence. Will scientists ever find Vagatisburg Fortress? The question is debatable. Historians do at least know the most important piece of information: the outcome of that legendary battle. The Frankish king Dagobert I already had 2 triumphant battles under his belt. The Slavs, on the other hand, had suffered a humiliating defeat, but had not lost morale. The main historical source, the Chronicles of Fredegar, offers a description of the battle. Having surrounded Vagatisburg Fortress, the Franks fought against the Slavs for 3 days. Many of those in Dagobert's army fell by the sword. Others fled. The Chronicles author does not hide his sympathy towards the Franks, and yet the fact remains: the Slavs were numerically disadvantaged against the Franks, but were able to seize victory. Furthermore, the Franks were not only forced to step back, but also to lose a whole group of peoples that had been under their influence. The fact is, having found out about the defeat of the Franks at the hands of Samo, the Serbi, who were positioned under Dagobert's overarching rule, made the decision to follow under Samo's leadership. After the battle at Vagatisburg, Emperor Samo's fame rose to unbelievable heights. This former merchant had succeeded in simultaneously relieving the Slavs from attack by 2 powerful enemies, the Avars from the east and the Franks from the west, as well as in creating a confederation of Slavic tribes. In fact, he had created the first Slavic state. Researchers often argue over the role of the individual in history. Who rules over whom? The individual or the historical process? Natural chronology or the individual? There is no definitive answer, yet sometimes fate and one person's biography speak for themselves. The first Slavic Tsar lived a long life. He ruled the Slavs for 35 years. Samo had 20 wives who gave him many children, yet after his death, there was no one to take on the rule of the first Slavic state. It broke apart, disappeared. The absence of a chief, a strong leader, turned out to be fatal for Samo's empire. There is one other and equally important reason for the breakup. Historians call Samo's territories a state only in a figurative sense. In reality, this was a typical union of settlements, a confederation of peoples which, under a common foreign threat, the Avarian yoke, had willingly bowed to the leadership of one person. As soon as that threat vanished, the Avars and Franks had been defeated, the union also disappeared. The union existed for only 35 years, and this was never a government in the full sense of the word. Yet Samo's empire played an enormous role in the history of the Slavs. This was the first dabble, the first Slavic attempt to create their own state. A successful attempt indeed. Only a few centuries later, in the 9th century, did the Slavs join together once more. And so the Great Moravia appeared in place of Samos Empire. This was a powerful inter-settlement formation with its own currency, army, capital, the remains of which archaeologists have discovered in the east of the Czech Republic, in the little-known town of Mikulčice. The foundations for this were laid out in the time of Samos Empire. After the year 658, when Samo died, the state did not fall apart completely. Laws and regulation norms were retained, perhaps even the armies and fortresses. I think that all of this was retained at the level of family unions. Gradually, this became the Great Moravian Empire. Once, long ago, the first Tsar of the first ever Slavic state brought together around himself many tribes and expanded their shared lands. That begs the question, why does it matter? It was out of these little victories that in the end, the common history of the Slavs came to be. Heading north, the Slavs slowly reached the northeast Baltic region, all the way to Ladoga. Sometime later, they gave rise to an ancient Russian state, from where it's easy to connect the strands to our modern-day world. Every one of us is tied to the past by imaginary strings. These strings, these connections, must be known and remembered.